So good morning, everybody. Welcome very much to Special Panel 5 at the 2021 Appalachian Studies Association Conference. This is a special panel from the 2020, originally planned for the 2020 Appalachian Studies Association Conference, and it's part of a series on the Appalachian Mother Forest and the Forest Commons, which was built by a team from the University of Kentucky, including the University of Kentucky Appalachian Center, especially, and also LICAN, Livelihoods Knowledge Exchange Network, a local grassroots organization, works throughout the region and is headquartered in Lexington, so is a near neighbor to the University of Kentucky. Today we have Steadfast in the Face of a Changing Climate, Reforestation on the Monongahela National Forest, a case study. Our convener is Dr. Kenton Sena of the University of Kentucky. Our panelists are Dr. Chris Barton of the University of Kentucky, Dr. Michaela Lambert of the University of Kentucky, and James Thompson of West Virginia University. It's part of we have 2 more panels this conference. All the special panels are on this theme of the Mother Forest. So we've got one this afternoon and another one tomorrow morning if you're interested in the series. Thanks everyone for being here. I want to particularly thank all our panelists for persisting not through just one round of conference planning, but through a second round and bringing their knowledge to us today. So now I'll turn it over to Kenton.
Thanks so much. And yeah, thanks for that reminder about the broader Mother Forest theme. And yesterday you had also mentioned that there will be an effort to do some follow-up, have some follow-up conversations around the forest in Appalachia, some cross-disciplinary follow-up conversations. So looking forward to seeing more information about that. So this is Steadfast in the Face of a Changing Climate, Reforestation on the Monongahela National Forest, a case study. Climate change poses a serious threat to human and non-human communities around the world, driving expansions, contractions, and shifts to species distribution ranges, and displacing human communities in more vulnerable regions. While the current climate change event is particularly rapid and severe, this is not the first time climate has undergone significant change. Research suggests that the Central Appalachian Mountains served in the past as important refugia during periods of climate change and suggests that they will once again serve as important refugia during the current climate change event. This session will explore a large-scale reforestation effort on the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia, which aims to restore a high-elevation red spruce forest. The session will focus on the critical wildlife habitat, carbon storage, and ecosystem structure provided by this unique ecosystem. And first up, we have Dr. Chris Barton of the University of Kentucky and Green Forest's work. Chris Barton is a professor of forest hydrology and watershed management in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources at UK. He currently works in the areas of ecosystem restoration, reforestation, and remediation, primarily in streams, wetlands, and mined lands. In addition, improved methods for preventing water quality degradation from land use activities are being examined. Dr. Barton is an associate editor for the International Journal for Phytoremediation and the International Journal of Mining, Reclamation, and the Environment. Dr. Barton is also the founder of Green Forest's Work, a program to improve the environment and economy of Appalachian mine landscapes. Through this program, nearly 3 million trees have been planted on mine lands in Appalachia and Australia, and over 20,000 volunteers have participated. So without further ado, Dr. Barton.
Thanks, Kenton. See if I can get this to work this time. All right, can you see my screen?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, thanks. So my talk today is going to be about a large-scale ecological restoration project that we've had ongoing in the Monongahela National Forest for about 11 years now. So when people talk about Appalachia, many things come to mind: the people, the place, the culture, the art, the music. But to me, Appalachia has always meant and always will mean these beautiful, forested and mountainous areas. And it's really the reason why I chose the career I have, or because of these forested lands. But these lands have a long history of disturbance associated with them. Over 100 years ago, these areas were logged heavily during the industrial logging area, and many of the forests we have now are second growth forests due to this extensive logging practices. A second threat to the forest of Appalachia more recently has been extensive surface mining, and we now have over 1 million acres of previously forested area in the Appalachian region that has been logged, scalped, mined, and then recontoured or rehabilitated, generally not to a forested land use. So the project I'm going to talk about actually suffered from both of those activities. I'm focusing on an area in the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia called the Mauer Tract. And this is about a 40,000 acre tract of land that the Forest Service acquired in the 1980s. It's on Cheat Mountain, which is a high elevation point in the Monongahela National Forest. This area contains one of the largest remaining red spruce communities south of Maine. The plant community on Cheat Mountain contains about 145 state rare plant species, 60 critical imperiled species, 56 imperiled species, and 29 vulnerable species. There are also like 137 wildlife species of concern on Cheat Mountain. So the Nature Conservancy has listed this area as a top priority for conservation and preservation for enhancing biological diversity. And it's really an important area because it kind of is on the spine of the Appalachian Mountain Terrain, and it is a sort of a vertical corridor that happens to be a really important migratory corridor for a whole host of animals. So again, a top priority for conservation and preservation. Unfortunately, though, this area was affected by some of the problems I talked about earlier. The red spruce hardwood forest of West Virginia once occupied about 500,000 acres of high elevation landscape in the mountains. Extensive logging in the area in the late 1800s and early 1900s, primarily for the pulp and paper industry, deforested a large amount of that 500,000 acres. While they were logging it, fires sparked by trains, campfires, some slash and burn, different things caused the landscape to burn after the logs were taken out of this area. And what happened then was the soils in these sites were peaty soils. They dried up, they caught on fire. And when that happened, you actually burned up the seed bank of the remnant red spruce forest. And so instead of regenerating as a red spruce forest, the area actually regenerated to a hardwood dominated system, and only about 50,000 acres or 10% of the original 500,000 acres remains in the high elevation parts of West Virginia. So the other problem was that on the Mauer Tract, about 2,500 acres were contour mined for coal in the 1980s. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of this land, instead of being reclaimed as forest, was reclaimed as pasture. Some of it was reclaimed as forest, but unfortunately they used non-native conifer species, usually red pine, instead of the native red spruce or other native hardwood forest. So what you have in these areas are a lot of grasslands, and the plantations that were planted are monocultures of a non-native species. They're stunted, and they contain almost no understory within that area. And these mined landscapes now exhibit what we refer to as arrested succession. And arrested succession just means that the landscape doesn't naturally succeed back to the forest that it was prior to the disturbance, like you would see in a general logging type of operation. You cut the trees out, you walk away for a few years, you come back and the forest is regenerated. Well, the loss of the seed bank, it gets buried during the mining process, and the site becomes compacted due to all the heavy equipment. And so you see that what is planted there during the reclamation phase is what ends up being there for a long time because of physical and chemical issues with the soils. So the two typical things that we see on the landscape are like the picture on the left of a red pine plantation with literally nothing in the understory. Or on the right, you see these extensive pastures that have not been mowed, and they remain. This site was actually, reclaimed in the 1980s. So for 30 years, it has been in this sort of state of pasture with no natural colonization to a more native type of situation. So I have a nonprofit organization called Green Forest Work, and we have been working for the last 10, 12 years to go to sites that exhibit this sort of arrested succession and put them back on a trajectory to where they can be restored to the native forest that was there before the mining activities occurred. And one of the principal things we have to do to make that happen is decompact the land. The Surface Mine Control and Reclamation Act requires that the sites be returned to their original contour. And the interpretation of that by the mining companies was to smooth everything out with heavy bulldozers and track it in so that it doesn't move, it doesn't erode, and you have no landslides. But you do that at the cost of the forest. Trees will not grow in compacted soil, and water doesn't infiltrate well in compacted soil. So one of the things that we do in our Green Forest Work projects are to go in with the same bulldozers that they use to probably compact it and decompact the land using ripping shanks and different devices that we can hook to excavators like shown in the picture. So we started work on the Monongahela National Forest in 2010 after the Forest Service had attempted to restore red spruce on these sites, but they didn't use our techniques of decompacting the land and removing invasive species and whatnot. And so those early efforts that they tried were unsuccessful. We partnered with them. We came in and showed them that we could, remove the non-native conifer species via, knocking them down with a bulldozer or chainsawing them down. We leave those on site because there's not very much organic matter on these sites, and so they can actually help build the soils over time. And then we go in with bulldozers and rip up the land like the picture in the top right. Through these projects, we're also creating wetlands on these sites. The bottom left is an excavator that's creating a wetland to hold water and provide habitat for amphibians that Michaela will talk about next. And then we've also engaged the local community in tree planting events. These young women on the bottom right are from the Green Bank Middle School. And actually, these two girls have participated in several tree planting events on this site. So we've had nearly 1,000 local volunteers come out and volunteer to plant trees on this site. So here's an image. You can see sort of the pine plantations that we're taking out and replacing with spruce plantations and other native natural hardwood and shrub species. So Barton Bench is one of the first sites that we worked on, oddly enough, with my name being Barton. And we planted that site in 2011. So here's a picture in 2016, 5-year-old trees coming along nicely. Here's a picture from the same site last summer. The trees are now taller than me. They're about 10 feet tall, and they're approaching that stage where we're getting, another year or two, we should have canopy closure, and that should shade out some of the weeds and stuff like that below that you see. But they're doing really well. We've had like 90% survival of the trees we planted on this site, and we've really seen sort of a transformation of that landscape. Here's a picture from last month on that site. They had about 2 feet of snow up there, but you can see all the little spruce are adapted to those cold environments and are doing really well. Another thing that we have been tracking through the course of this project is the actual, reversal of that arrested succession. And one of the things we hope to see when we rip up the land is that we've provided a place where native seed can actually naturally germinate. So birds are coming in and perching on the trees that we plant and dropping seed, wind is blowing it in. And we've seen really an explosion of native plants on these sites. As you can see in this little graph on the bottom right, before we ripped, we had a little over 30 species of plants on the site. And then after we ripped, we had over 100 species come in. Most of these, I think it was 87 of them, were native plants that we hadn't observed on the site before. So really, not only are we planting the forest back, but we are breaking that arrested succession and letting, natural colonization occur on these sites. Since we've started, we generally build about 100 wetlands a year. Throughout the entire process, we've had over 1,400 vernal pools, and these are just small wetlands, but they're very important for habitat, as you'll hear with Michaela here in a minute. We've also been decommissioning old logging roads and mining roads to reduce erosion and sedimentation, and we have planted thousands of native wetland plants and propagated seed that we collected from seed from the forest and propagated them ourselves. We've also been seeding hundreds and hundreds of pounds of native pollinator plants on these sites. So here's an example of one of the wetlands we've created, and this is a really moist, wet environment, so there's many opportunities for creating these type of wetlands. And they're also great for educational purposes, and the kids from the schools around the area love to come up and play with salamander eggs and really explore these areas. So one of the things that Green Forest Work does is we're not only trying to improve the environment, but we're also trying to build local economies in Appalachia as we see the decline of the coal economy. And we're doing this through hiring equipment operators to come out and build our wetlands and decompact the soil. We have folks that we're paying to collect native seeds so that we can grow those in our nurseries and greenhouses. We're paying people to, also grow these, and we're buying all of these trees from local greenhouses and nurseries. We're paying people to come out and plant trees. And we're also, in the long term, people are going to be involved in the monitoring and maintenance of this site. So in all, we're creating jobs now. We're also providing training opportunities for groups like the Appalachian Conservation Corps. During COVID last year, we normally have a lot of volunteer tree planting events and things like that, but all those were canceled. But we were able to bring in several groups of Appalachian Conservation Corps who lived on the site and planted trees and helped with seeding and helped with maintenance on these sites. So they made some money during the pandemic, but they also learned some new skills that hopefully they can take forward with them. So one of the neat, things about this site is some of the, reasons that we do this work is to build back, the local economy, and also to provide new opportunities for, former coal miners. And Bill Moore is a guy who actually worked on the mine when they were mining it back in the 80s. He retired, and he came out of retirement to work for us, driving a bulldozer to, decompact the soil. And he spent probably about 6 years helping us out on these projects. And so he basically created a new career for himself after the mining was done, which is kind of interesting. He always complained that he would have got fired for doing what he was doing to decompact these soils when he was working for the mine, but he understood the ecological reasons of why we did it. So after May of this year, we will have planted about 650,000 native trees and shrubs on the Mauer track. And over 1,200 acres will have been reforested, with nearly 50% of that being red spruce. We have funds already in hand for another 200 acres in 2022, and maybe one more year, and we should be done with all of the mining land on the Mauer track itself. So as I said earlier, over 1,400 vernal pools have been created. Over 600 volunteers have participated in planting events. And, importantly, we've put about $3 million just on this one project back into the local economy for contracts, equipment, tree planters, seedlings, etc. And this doesn't include, money for salary for Forest Service people involved and salaries for Green Forest Work employees and myself. It's just the money that we're putting back into this community. So once we're finishing up the Mauer tract, we're moving over into other parts of the Monongahela. Within the proclamation boundary of the Monongahela National Forest, there's about 25,000 acres of old mine land. So we're hoping to address those all over the next decade or so. So I'd like to end with a quote from the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, Gary Moffat, who said, "The act of planting a tree reconnects the human spirit to the beauty and importance of the natural world, the basis for all life on Earth." And I think this project is a really good example of, reconnecting the forest and the people in this area, and really working to do something positive for the climate and something positive for the economy of that area. Okay, with that, I will turn it over to Michaela, and I'm assuming we're going to have questions later. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, we will take questions at the end. I'll go ahead and introduce Michaela. Michaela Lambert is a graduate of the University of Kentucky with a Bachelor of Science degrees in Natural Resources and Environmental Science and Equine Science and Management. As an undergraduate, Michaela worked with Dr. Price's Herpetology and Stream Ecology Lab for 3 years and assisted with most of the lab projects. Her own research in the Price Lab investigated the calling behavior of the threatened crawfish frog. Michaela also completed a National Science Foundation research experience for undergraduates at the Savannah River Ecology Lab, where she investigated the sublethal metabolic effects of radiocesium and mercury contamination in Florida green water snakes. As a graduate student, Michaela was co-advised by Drs. Chris Barton and Stephen Price, studying how local and landscape factors affect amphibian occupancy, abundance, and species richness of artificial wetlands on a reforested surface mine in the Monongahela National Forest. Currently, Michaela works for the Kentucky Division of Water as a basin coordinator in the non-point source and basin team of the Watershed Management Branch. Most of her work resides in the eastern part of the state in the tributaries of the Big Sandy River and the Appalachian coal fields. Without further ado, Michaela.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, and we can see your slides.
That's great. I lost all of everything so I can't see you all, but I'll just continue on. Okay, thanks so much. Like Chris said, my work was having to do with his project in the Mauer Tract and the reforestation and evaluating the effectiveness of those created wetlands for amphibian habitat in the Monongahela National Forest. Oh boy, we are frozen. Okay, can you see the amphibians decline slide?
Yes.
Perfect, all right. So if you're not already familiar, amphibians are one of the vertebrate taxa that are most threatened with declines. Threats have included diseases like ranavirus and chytrid, but also habitat loss and habitat degradation. One of the reasons the latter two have been so detrimental is the fact that amphibians are particularly sensitive to environmental change. So things like changes in temperature, changes in moisture, and any sort of exposure to contaminants can be detrimental. And this is because amphibians both breathe and osmoregulate through their skin. So they're relying heavily on their environment for their success. Wetlands are particularly important habitat for the pond breeding amphibians. And unfortunately, we've seen natural wetland declines at a large scale worldwide. So one such land use that has resulted in some natural wetland loss, particularly high elevation natural wetland loss, has been the surface mining for coal. Like Dr. Barton just mentioned, there are some ecological consequences to surface mining for coal. In the reclamation process, you end up with these compacted soils. You have this pervasiveness of non-native vegetation, and you're often lacking those natural habitat features that would have been there. But that really begs the question, if we're able to reforest these areas, decompact them, restore that native vegetation, and some of those native habitat features, like those wetlands, those vernal pools, can we create habitat that will benefit the high elevation species that live there and kind of restore some of those maybe lost ecological functions. And so that's really kind of what we want to know. If we put these high elevation wetlands in, can we provide habitat for high elevation amphibians? And so most of the research done to date has really looked at the effects of surface mining on stream salamanders. A lot of work has shown reduced stream salamander occupancy rates, abundance rates, colonization rates, persistence rates, and multiple mechanisms have been identified for why that is. Much of this is because these streams are oftentimes affected by valley fills, so they've got that overburden draining into that natural stream, or it's completely covered. And a lot of those mechanisms that have been identified because of that are water quality related. So sometimes we see really high conductivities, low pHs, high sulfates, high metals, and things like that. But there also are some issues with habitat that have been identified. Maybe the habitat connectivity is a problem. Amphibians aren't able to utilize the environment the way that they normally would. They can't move around the environment the way that they normally would. So looking more specifically at wetlands, not as much is known. Laufman, 2005, found that newts were able to breed in artificial wetlands on an abandoned mine in West Virginia. And while spotted salamanders were seen breeding and they did lay eggs, there was no growth or development of those eggs. Lanu et al. 2009 suggested that mine spoil habitats, including some wetlands, could be critical habitat for threatened and endangered species. And this was because he found the endangered crawfish frog, it's endangered in the state of Indiana, in mine spoil habitat. In Stiles 2016, found that 14 amphibians colonized a reclaimed strip mine and suggested that reclaimed, restored, and properly managed post-disturbance landscapes may provide adequate habitat for breeding amphibians. So that's really the question that we wanted to answer. If we decompact these soils, reforest this area, restore those replace those wetlands that were lost, can these reforested surface mines provide habitat for pond breeding amphibians? And so to answer that, we had two main research objectives. The first was to investigate amphibian occupancy and abundance in the wetlands. We wanted to know what species were there, and we wanted to know how many individuals were there. We also want to determine which habitat characteristics are most important for amphibian utilization of the wetlands. So in the Mauer Tract, for example, wetland creation has been ongoing, but also there's the possibility of doing wetland creation in other areas. So we want to identify which habitat characteristics were most important for amphibian occupancy and abundance. So for my study site, I also worked on the Mauer Tract on Cheat Mountain in Monongahela National Forest. Because Dr. Barton did such a good job just covering that site, I'm just going to kind of do a quick recap. Historically, this area was red spruce, northern hardwood, peatland. It was logged and then subsequently burned of some very hot wildfires that destroyed the peat and the seed stock that was within it. Then in the 1980s, it was contour mined for coal and then restored according to the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, or reclaimed according to the Surface Mining and Reclamation Act. And so the land was compacted. It was planted with non-native conifer and grasslands and has, as a result, sat in arrested development until about 2010, when the U.S. Forest Service and Green Forest Work partnered and began the reforestation effort. So they decompacted the land, started planting, and also did some wetland creation. So in total, I had 39 wetlands spread across 4 age classes. And so these were wetlands that were created in 2010, 2012, 2014, and 2016, or that were 8, 6, 4, and 2 years old at the time. We had 10 wetlands in each age class, except for the oldest wetlands, the 2010 wetlands. There are 9 wetlands in that age class. So for our habitat sampling, the first thing we did was estimate wetland surface area. We just did that by measuring the long side and the width, multiplying. We also calculated percent vegetation cover, both emergent and submergent, and we did this using 4 square meter quadrats, So one was placed on the north edge, one was placed on the south edge, and 2 placed in the middle, and we took that average. We also calculated distance to the nearest forest using the near function in ArcGIS. And then we did take some water samples to investigate water quality. And although I didn't use this as part of my investigation, we did want to know how our water quality compared to those streams that are so impacted by surface mining, but also to other wetlands, or what would be normal for the area. So I had 5 samples from May through July of 2018. We used 16 by 9 D-frame dip nets, so a pretty standard wetland dip net. We determined the number of sweeps based on wetland size. So a sweep is like a meter swoop of the net. And we did 1 scoop for every 2 sweeps for every 1 square meter, or 2 square meters, excuse me. All cover types were sampled evenly: emergent vegetation, submergent vegetation, open water, logs, rocks, etc. We counted adult and larval amphibians, as well as identified them down to species. And we finally used the hierarchical occupancy and bundling models with AIC model selection and the unmarked package in RStudio to estimate occupancy and abundance while accounting for imperfect detection. The habitat parameters that we used were wetland age, surface area, percent vegetation cover, and distance to forest. Okay, for some of our results, overall we had over 2,200 amphibian captures. If you look at the top table, we have wetland age in the far left column, and we have number of amphibian captures in the far right column. We had the most number of amphibian captures of 651 in the 2-year-old wetlands, 598 captures in the 4-year-old wetlands, 519 captures in the 6-year-old wetlands, and 475 captures in the 8-year-old wetlands. And then if you look in the bottom table, you'll see that we have amphibian species in the far left-hand column, and we have age class in the top row. And then wherever there is an X, that denotes whether or not we found that species within the age class. So we found the most number of species in the oldest age class, the 8-year-old wetlands, the second most number of species in the 2-year-old age class, and a tie for third most species in the age 4 and 6-year-old wetlands. So we had enough data to do occupancy modeling with 5 species, which is the green frog, the wood frog, spring peeper, the eastern red-spotted newt, and the spotted salamander. We had enough data to do abundance modeling for 4 species, so those same 5 species minus the spring peeper. So looking at some of our occupancy results, we generally saw for Imbecilla maculatum, or the spotted salamander, and Lithobates climatans, the green frog, that as percent vegetation cover increased, we tended to see a decrease in the occupancy. And for the other 3 species that we did occupancy modeling with, Notothalamus viridescens, the eastern red-spotted newt, Lithobates sylvaticus, the wood frog, and Pseudacus crucifer, the spring peeper, our null model was the best supported model. So basically that meant that the habitat parameters that we chose did not adequately explain the occupancy of those species. Looking at some of the abundance data, if we look at the top 2 parts of this figure, we'll see Imbecilla maculatum and Notothalamus viridescens, the 2 salamander species. Both saw increasing abundance rates with increasing wetland surface area. Notothalamus viridescens also saw increasing abundance with increasing percent vegetation cover and decreasing distance to forest. And for our abundance modeling, the 2 species of frenurans or frogs that we looked at, the wood frog and the green frog, the null model was the best fit. So none of the habitat parameters that we looked at adequately explained the abundance of those 2 species. When looking at the effects of age, for Imbecilla maculatum, the spotted salamander, we tended to see the lowest abundance in the 4-year-old age class. And then for both Imbecilla maculatum, the spotted salamander, and Lithobates climatans, the green frog, occupancy tended to vary with age as well, but not really a clear pattern. So So generally, we found that occupancy was predicted by wetland age for Lithobates climatans, which is the green frog, and lower percent vegetation cover for Embysma maculatum and Lithobates climatans. For the other three species, Notothalamus viridescens, the eastern red-spotted newt, Pseudacus crucifer, the spring peeper, and Lithobates sylvaticus, the null model was the best model, so those habitat parameters did not adequately explain the occupancy of those species. For the abundance of salamanders, was best predicted by wetland age for Embysma maculatum, higher percent vegetation cover for Notothalamus viridescens, larger wetland size for both salamander species, and shorter distance to forest for Notothalamus viridescens. And for the two frog species, the wood frogs and the green frogs, abundance was not adequately explained by our habitat parameters. So really what it comes down to, though, is that it appears that these wetlands were useful for amphibian breeding habitat. We saw a varied response to percent vegetation cover. For the newts, we saw an increased abundance with increased vegetation cover. This makes sense. Newts usually attach their legs to some sort of aquatic vegetation. But we did see decreasing occupancy for green frogs and spotted salamanders with percent vegetation cover. This could be something that's species specific, or it could be due to something else entirely. For the newts, they generally had higher abundances if they were closer to the forests. Some of the oldest wetlands were actually still within the forest. But for the other species, it didn't seem to matter. And that could have to do with the fact that there was a lot of habitat connectivity here, where there's a lot of still downed woody debris, rocks, and other material that provides cover and some moisture for amphibians to utilize around the landscape. We generally found for the salamanders that they had higher abundances with the wetlands with larger surface area. We did find that the wetlands were colonized relatively quickly. Our youngest wetlands at the time were 2 years old, and they had the second highest number of species and the highest number of individual captures. And we did generally find good water quality. The water quality was what we would expect for the area. It was normal and far lower than we see in impacted streams by surface mining. And so really, something we really need to look into in the future is how do these wetlands change over time? You know, one of the functions of these wetlands, not only as providing habitat, but also to absorb some of the sediment from the deep ripping and the decompaction activity. So how do those wetlands change over time, especially as that sediment comes in and the vegetation grows up? And we also want to know whether or not these wetlands serve as source populations, and so they're producing amphibians, or if they're sink populations. We have amphibians coming and reproducing, but those eggs aren't maturing, and we don't have any metamorphs leaving the wetlands. I can say anecdotally, we did see metamorphs of multiple species leaving the wetlands, so right now, it seems like this is something that looks like it's been successful. Wetland creation is ongoing on the Mauer Tract, and hopefully throughout Appalachia, we have more surface mines that could benefit from some wetland creation and reforestation, and it seems like something that could be very promising. And so with that, I'd like to thank the people who helped me on this. There is a quote from a book called The Lost Cambrian. If you ever need some dry science humor, it's a great book. But it's science is a richly social endeavor, and it really is. It's very hard to do anything by yourself. And so I'd really like to thank my committee members, Dr. Chris Barton, Stephen Price, and John Cox, as well as everybody who helped me in the lab, in the field, helped me bounce ideas off them. I really appreciate everything, as well as my funding sources. Finally, the last thing that I want to leave you with is this quote by Wendell Berry that I think sums it up well. To cherish what remains of the earth and to foster its renewal is our only legitimate hope for survival. And that just kind of goes to show that if we can protect what remains and work to restore what we perceive to have lost, then there's some hope for the future. And I think this project on the Mauer Tract and this wetland creation and reforestation really goes to show that. And so that's what I have to offer you today. I'll take any questions at the very end, and thank you so much for listening.
Thanks, Michaela.
Sorry for the technical difficulties there for a second.
No, great work pivoting and taking care of that. So next up, we have James Leonard from West Virginia University. James is a master's student studying environmental soil and water quality with the Department of Plant and Soil Sciences at West Virginia University. He got his undergraduate degree from West Virginia University, majoring in agroecology with a focus on soils. James is a pathways soil scientist with USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service and is part of the research committee in the Central Appalachian Spruce Restoration Initiative, of which he's been a member for about 4 years. So looking forward to your presentation on forest restoration potential using ecological site descriptions. And James, are you joining via phone at this point?
No, I actually relocated myself to another house with better internet connection, so I should be good.
Cool. Awesome. Great. Okay, well, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much. Can everybody see the slides okay and hear me?
I can hear you, and here's the slides. The slides just came up.
Okay, wonderful. All right, well, I will begin. So Clyde Thompson, retired Monongahela National Forest supervisor, used to say, to manage the forest, we must manage the soil. To restore the ecosystem, we must restore the soil. He could not have been more correct. By using soils and ecological site descriptions to guide red spruce restoration, we can know why these ecosystems are important, identify where red spruce were in the past, while also understand how to go about the restoration process. So a little bit of brief history. From the late 1800s to the early 1900s, an estimated 1.5 billion, with a B, board feet of lumber was cut from West Virginia alone, significantly reducing the native range of red spruce, what we can see roughly relegated to this green portion on the map. Often the fires were too hot to put out and consumed the organic matter-rich surface all the way down to the mineral soil, eliminating the forest's sponge-like water-absorbing capabilities. In the picture here, we can see the charred remains of trees and exposed boulders littering the soil surface. Before this disturbance, these boulders were likely covered by a thick layer of organic matter. At one point in time, there's been many estimates, but up to 1 million acres of red spruce forest types were estimated to exist in West Virginia alone. But currently, the Department of Natural Resources estimates that somewhere around 170,000 acres remain, and this can be seen here in the green on the map. The resulting catastrophe can be laid at the feet of people's misunderstanding and ignorance of the importance of soils. So since most of the red spruce communities were clear-cut, burned, or logged, there was nothing left to keep the huge volumes of water in the upland soils. The upland forests lost their ability to act like a sponge and hold massive quantities of water, resulting in extreme flooding throughout the East Coast. Towns like Parkersburg, West Virginia, Huntington, West Virginia, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and beyond were subject to inundation by floodwaters. The outcomes seen from intensive logging practices like this demonstrate why soils are so important. But why are soils so important in the grand scheme of things? Soils occupy a very peculiar place in the natural order, being a combination of both non-living and living things and bridging the gap between non-life and life. It is said that 1 teaspoon of soil can hold more microorganisms than there are humans on the planet, and estimates put up to 1/4 of the world's biodiversity lying in the soil alone. Soils also hold more carbon than the Earth's vegetation and atmosphere put together. And in the soil, additions, losses, and transformations to carbon is pretty much the currency through which life functions. So there are carbon hotspots in the world of soils. Some soils are more effective at capturing carbon than others, and managing these soils to do so is important. The most effective soils at storing carbon are probably the wetland, the prairie, and the tundra soils of the world, but there are others too. Here we see soils with different amounts of organic matter and carbon. On the far left, we have our arid desert soils with little organic matter, and on the right, we have soils with very high organic matter and carbon. The desert soils are not typically dark at the surface nor throughout the entire profile, while prairie soils on the far right here are often thick and dark at the surface and decrease in darkness as we move down in depth. While the typical wetland profile seen here is extremely dark through the profile and is very high in organic matter and carbon. So how does carbon affect soils, and why is it so important? The web that's connected to carbon is complex. Beginning with carbon, we can see its connection with a few soil properties. These related soil properties also have their own relationships to other soil properties and ultimately to ecosystem services too. As carbon relates to bulk density influences aeration and porosity, which also affects water holding capacity, infiltration rates, which culminates with downstream flood mitigation and flood abatement. Or as another example, carbon influences soil structure, which allows structure to become stronger and more pronounced. And this further affects porosity and aggregate stability, culminating in reduced erosion and reduction in downstream sedimentation in rivers and streams. The properties and ecosystem services displayed on the slide are by no means a complete picture for the influence of carbon in soils. The capacity, though, for carbon to store, or for soil to store carbon, is one thing that makes red spruce soils so unique. So red spruce ecosystems are not your typical forest type. They can store significant amounts of carbon in the organic layers at the surface of the soil, as we see here, as well as deeper in the subsoil. At the surface, organic matter builds up quickly due to its slower than usual decomposition rate, illustrated by the dark colors in the photos. Conifer roots and decomposing conifer needles produce organic acids that move downward through the soil profile. And in the subsoil, these organic materials are relatively protected from decomposition because they form compounds with iron oxides and other things. And this is illustrated by these dark brown and deep red colors in the subsoil. This places red spruce in an interesting, red spruce soils in an interesting position in terms of carbon storage potential related to other forest types in central Appalachia. But now that we know the what and the why, we need to know where to restore red spruce. And often the biggest question that we're faced when doing so is, where do we put them? Within the soil, there are stories that tell us how the soil came to be, of which land managers can use to guide restoration and conservation in the future. We can understand the story by reading the different properties that are on display in a soil profile. Properties like color or structure and a suite of others help us to tell this story. The most important of these properties to us in red spruce restoration can be visualized by dark brown, black, and red colors in the subsoil. These key properties represent the distinguishing factor from these soils and all others. And this property that these colors display are what we soil scientists refer to technically as spodic properties. So on the left, we have a brown surface layer that's only a few centimeters thick, and it has very minimal color development in the subsoil. This soil shows no signs of red spruce influence in the overstory. While in the middle, we have a soil that has a thicker and darker surface, somewhere around 15 centimeters, and a reddish kind of hue in this subsoil. This soil shows properties that are in line with spruce influencing at a minor component in the overstory vegetation. While on the very far right, we have a soil that is very, very dark at the surface and is greater than 20 centimeters thick as far as the organic layer. It has a strong brown, red, and black staining throughout the subsoil, and this soil depicts red spruce as being dominant in the ecosystem above the soil. So in central Appalachia, these properties, these spodic properties, are a byproduct of conifer vegetation growing in cool, moist environments. The presence of these properties tells us that red spruce grew here at a given location, enabling us to identify where red spruce inhabited prior to historic logging. These properties are quite literally the soil's memory of red spruce in the past. Knowing this means we know where to put red spruce back when restoring, but it also helps us to understand what we should conserve. So past research by Nauman and others have illustrated the connection between these soils and the soil properties for red spruce. This research even mapped the occurrence of these soil properties, offering a tool that estimates the probability of a given location to contain them. As we can see on this map on the right-hand side, the blue areas represent or highlight areas with the highest probabilities that these properties will occur, while the yellow is the lowest probabilities, and green kind of is in between. These locations are generally relegated to the mountain ridge tops and north and northwestern facing hill slopes, as well as the cold air drainage ways and the narrow valley bottoms and hollows. These properties effectively tell us where to put red spruce when restoring. But now, how are we supposed to restore? Well, ecological site descriptions has become a tool used by federal agencies to manage land and the ecosystems occurring on it. Ecological site descriptions describe a single, specific ecological site. One ecological site description cannot be used to manage and describe another ecological site. Factors influencing an ecological site's vegetation include climate, landform, the geology, the area's disturbance history, hydrology, the soils, and a suite of other things. Ecological site descriptions tell us the management practices that we need to use in order to restore an impacted ecosystem back towards its pre-disturbance status. And most importantly, though, ecological site descriptions and soils are explicitly linked as a core concept. Each ecological site has a different specific soil type, which is the most important factor that determines the ecological site. If the soil type does not occur in a given location, then neither does that ecological site. Just like we call plants by common names, we refer to soils by common names too. On the left here we have the wildell soil, and this soil exhibits properties that show a dominant spruce component in the forest community, or at least a dominant spruce component at some time in the past, if not present currently. While on the right, the Mandy soil exhibits soil properties that tell us that there's only a minor spruce component in the overstory at some time in the past or currently. These differences between the soils can easily be seen in the colors that are displayed throughout the profile, but especially in the subsoil here across both profiles. Understanding these differences between these soils and other soils is key to knowing how to manage the ecosystem, but also knowing what the end goal for the restoration plan should be. So the framework that ecological site descriptions use in order to do this is called a state and transition model, seen here on the slide. Taken all together, the diagram represents the entire ecological site. Each of the major boxes are referred to as ecological states. These are basically just different vegetation community types that occur in the ecological site. The reference state is typically thought of as the pre-disturbance state of the ecological site. And each arrow that connects alternative states to this reference state condition represent management practices. Arrows that are labeled a T are transitional pathways, and they represent disturbance events that move the ecosystem away from this pre-disturbance community, while arrows that are marked with an R are referred to as restoration pathways. They represent management practices used to guide the development of the ecosystem back towards the reference state. So, for example, to move from the 3.1 black cherry red maple with red spruce saplings understory state to the reference state condition, management practices R1 is required. R1 basically just means that this community needs to have the understory spruce be released by selective cutting, ringing, and herbicide application to the hardwood species on site. So with spruce restoration, as we reestablish spruce on the landscape, more and more carbon is added to the soil. Restoration changes are not only above ground changes, but changes that are below ground, changes to soil properties. In red spruce ecosystems, we seek to increase the amount of spruce, increase the proportion of red spruce relative to other hardwood species on site. And as a result, we increase the amount of carbon being held in soil. So carbon and the ecosystem services that stem from soils tell us why to restore. But the soils and the soil properties direct us to what and where to restore, while ecological site descriptions can help us describe how to go about the restoration process. So currently, our current research seeks to understand and connect the why, what, where, and how elements of red spruce restoration by using soil carbon stocks related to each of these forest community types described in the ecological site description. As we can see here, the preliminary analysis of field data that I collected this past year shows average O horizon thickness, the organic surface layer thickness, is greatest in the reference state community. This trend also seems to be similar to the other ecological site that we're looking at, but that we're not going to discuss in this presentation. And in time, we will be able to estimate the average soil carbon content and carbon stock of the soil, as well as the degree in which they vary per individual forest type. Knowing this will help us to understand the changes to ecosystem services and soil properties that we can expect to see when restoring a specific site, resulting in more effective management and a higher restoration red spruce success. I'll leave you with an end slide quote, one of my favorite quotes about red spruce from Leon Minkler. A typical spruce tree is born, lives, and dies in a soil literally created from its ancestors. Thank you very much.
Awesome, thanks, James. So we have, I think, 15 minutes for questions. Does anybody have any questions? I am seeing a question from Betsy in the chat from Michaela. How do these artificial wetlands compare with occupancy rates in natural wetlands?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
So we did find that they were comparable to natural wetlands. We didn't, and artificial wetlands actually, but we didn't have any reference conditions within West Virginia in our area. So we looked at wetlands that were in Wisconsin actually, but they were comparable.
A question from Jasper. What does the management plan for spruce on restored mining lands look like?
So it's a little different than what James was talking about. The release, the spruce are already there, and you're just basically opening up, providing proper sunlight conditions for the spruce to come out and become mature. On the mine lands, the seed bank is gone. The soil is nothing like it was prior to the mining. So we have to go in and actually plant the spruce. But we're not just planting spruce. Last year, we planted over 50 different native trees and shrubs on that site. We're also seeding in a lot of native pollinator plants. So we're starting from ground zero on these mine sites and trying to build what we think the forests looked like before. So early on, it's just planting everything, spruce, aspen, cherry, whatnot, waiting for it to grow. And then probably at some point in time, maybe 30 years down the line, then you'd probably have to go in and manage to make sure you have the proper structure that you want that forest to have. But yeah, so we're really starting from rock and rebuilding this system.
Great. Yeah, and a recent question or an additional question from Mary about restoration planning. So has anyone had occasion to consult local collective memory, both human and soil, in restoration planning? And Chris, it strikes me that that's a great question for you, given that you kind of work to develop species lists for planting these sites, and you also were talking about some of the native understory plants that you're working to restore on these sites. Can you comment on kind of the process for developing those lists?
Yeah, so one of the things we do as sort of a basic, ecological restoration principle is we try to identify what we call reference sites, or sites that have the least amount of disturbance that we can find. And we go into those sites and characterize what, the vegetation community is, and essentially try to replicate that. In some cases, we may not know, like the history of that red spruce forest. There are remnant forests left, but a lot of them have been logged, and so we don't have a lot of examples of virgin forests, if you will. So to know the exact composition of what was there, hundreds of years ago. But that's our best approach, is, looking at historical records, going and trying to find reference locations and using that to guide your restoration effort. James, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I can actually tag along that as far as consulting human collective memories. So some of that past research that I shared that culminated with soil property maps, those maps were actually correlated to the witness tree databases that we have within the Forest Service. So these witness tree databases record a certain species of tree at a certain location in time, typically back in the 1800s. A lot of times there were property markers or what, but there are examples, I guess, human knowledge from the past of where a tree existed. And so part of that research in the past was seeing if there's a relationship to the presence of historic red spruce accounts within the MON and relating those soil properties that I was speaking about. And there seemed to be a very good correlation between them. Kind of is way the human nature of history was kind of incorporated and used in red spruce restoration modeling from a soils perspective.
Great, awesome. And Mary, just keep updating if that does not really well answer your question. And I know Mary and others in our panel yesterday were asking about the possibilities of working to add non-timber forest products, species that are important for non-timber forest products into our restoration work as well. So I'm excited to continue to have that conversation.
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of, for instance, the Mauer track going forward. We just got funding to develop a native plant center in West Virginia, a new one that'll be in the Greenbrier area. And there's a lot of interest in utilizing these sites for pollinator habitat. As this panel about climate change, there's also a loss of pollinator species that we're seeing globally. And so these mine sites are kind of interesting because they can become sites that we can utilize for focused restoration or providing new habitat for things that are in decline. So a lot of our work is focused on, ultimately we want to restore, mature native forests, but in the interim, we're going to have, early successional habitat, which becomes very important for a lot of migratory bird species and things of that nature. So, for instance, right now on the Mauer track, we're creating really nice habitat for things like golden ring warbler, holly dows. So there's a lot of benefit you can get in the short term, even though our ultimate goal is to have a mature red spruce forest.
Great. So, and let me just take another couple questions. So Kathy, for all panelists, is asking about the possibility of a civilian climate corps modeled on the New Deal era civilian conservation corps. Could these types of restoration efforts be scaled up if that program made funding and labor available?
Absolutely. I've already been in talks with some folks in DC about it. And I think the work that we did last year with the Appalachian Conservation Corps is a perfect example of, we employed about, 20 different, young adults to come out, and they worked all summer, both in the Monongahela and the Daniel Boone National Forest, on our projects. And we think that there's enough of these areas where you could definitely scale that up. And it's such a really, I wasn't a big believer in these types of programs because we worked with them in the past, and it's been a lot of extra work on our part. But these groups worked very independently. They lived on the site. It was awesome. And so, in fact, I just got a grant to bring on 9 more groups this summer for Monongahela and Daniel Boone National Forest to continue this type of work. So I'm hoping that we can, get programs like that to grow through this Climate Conservation Corps.
Awesome. I'm seeing another couple questions. So James, a question for you. If there's any way to develop likely past soil profiles if the soil has been lost?
So the short answer is the only way to redevelop those properties is by putting red spruce back. Those properties that I were talking about and showing you that had the carbon, that were so effective at sequestering carbon in the subsoil, the only way to do that is by putting conifer species back that are lacking now, specifically those being red spruce. Yeah, it comes down to the spruce. A lot of times we see, so there's this process that happens when you clear cut a spruce forest. All those properties that we were seeing in the subsoil, those nice colors and the morphology of that profile, so a lot of times it can be lost. Those properties over time can degenerate and be lost from the soil. So we can still identify where red spruce were with certain properties, but it's that carbon is lost, and a lot of those services that stem from the soil ends up being lost too. Now, it's not always that case, but sometimes it is, and it really depends on environmental variables of the location. But in short, you got to put the in order to get those properties back like they were.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And Kenton and I have been doing some work on looking at soil genesis on these mine lands, and they do actually, start to rapidly accumulate organic matter in the upper parts, but it takes a long time for that to migrate. But that process would be probably more than one rotation. It'd be probably several hundred years for that podulization to occur.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, anywhere from hundreds to even thousands sometimes of years, and then the loss of those same properties can be only decades, depending on how disturbed the landscape ends up being.
Exactly.
It's amazing.
And I'm going to circle us back to Mary, back to Mary's question. Mary said, and also Betty and Betsy. So oral histories, local traditional ecological knowledge, and Betsy is saying that genocide of indigenous peoples interrupted land management practices that have been put in place for centuries. Do our models for what are native forests adequately reflect that, or are they based on 19th century forests that had already been deeply changed? So kind of back to our questions, the question about how we're characterizing these, what we're characterizing as reference forests, or kind of our target forest for restoration. And does that incorporate traditional ecological knowledge, oral histories, and other forms of human memory?
I can speak to that a little bit, not a ton. But so, in my eyes, in certain places, the pre-disturbance status of the ecosystems may have been definitely regulated by Native Americans in different locations. As far as the places, the two ecological sites that I specifically spoke about, to my knowledge, those high elevation mountains were really not habited. Maybe they were, but as far as I know, there wasn't centers for, their cultures there. And maybe there were, and maybe I'm just ignorant of it. I'm not the most well versed in that. But so with those ecological site descriptions I was talking about, those two specific ones, a lot of what we know as far as what those native communities might have been come from the oldest records that we have, as far as different people writing about these forests back in the mid 1800s and earlier sometimes, and later as well. And sometimes that's as close as we can get to an oral or recorded history of what the site might have been. And there's some really awesome literature that describe these really deep, dark, wet forests covered in rhododendron and spruce that sunlight doesn't even make it through the canopy, and it's just shaded everywhere. So certainly,
yeah.
And I'll just to try to reflect that, but it's different in different locations.
Yeah, and I agree with that. It depends on where we are. We have 4 new projects that we're starting this year in Australia, and every one of them we're engaging the indigenous community to learn about the history, because the landscape was completely altered, and a lot of the projects we're working on are either old mine lands or abandoned agricultural land. So we've engaged the indigenous community there to not only provide information about the historical land use, but also to participate, just like we're doing in Appalachia, providing jobs and opportunities for people to actually help to restore the landscape. So that's an exciting part of those projects. And, like James said, there's been a lot. The Central Appalachian Spruce Restoration community has really looked into the historical, the history of that red spruce community. And the American Chestnut Foundation also has, delved heavily into the lore and the history of chestnut in Appalachia. So there's some of that going on, but then there's some, of just managing the way we manage things in the 21st century. So it's a hodgepodge.
And I'll just, comment. I think it's a great question, and I appreciate. Thanks, Mary and others, for hanging in there to help us understand the question. And I would just say, let's have let's continue the conversation on how we can better engage local indigenous communities, better leverage traditional ecological knowledge in these sites, and better capture some of that history, human history in these spaces as we think about what restoration should look like and what ongoing management should look like. I think we are out of time at 10:15. Just a quick question from Jerica about forests in Martin County related to the Martin County historical Martin County spill. So a little bit different from the Monongahela, but has Chris or anybody else any perspectives on that?
Well, Martin County is an interesting county. About a third of Martin County has been surface mined, and so there's extensive work to be done. We have done over 1,000 acres of reforestation in Martin County, and that was done about 20 years ago. And we have some really good examples of emerging forest, closed canopy, diverse forest. But yeah, that particular county, if you want to pick one county in Appalachia that has probably been hit hardest by mining, I might go with Martin County, Kentucky. But there are lots of opportunities. There's lots of conversations going on around water resources. land rehabilitation in that county. So hopefully we'll see some efforts, move forward there.
I can speak to that a little bit. Not so much from the forest aspect, but I can speak to it from the water quality aspect. So the state put together a task force to address Martin County water quality issues. That was one of the governor's pet projects. So they have multiple people working on that right now, both from the non-point source side and the point source side and working with infrastructure. We also have, excuse me, some groups over there that are interested in getting involved in some watershed planning and engaging the citizens and being more active in their own land management and water quality. So I think there's a lot of things that are starting over there, and they should see some improvements in the future. There's a lot of money and time being invested looking at Martin County and kind of using that as a model to address other areas in the eastern part of the state that largely suffer the same problems. Martin County just happens to get a lot of that attention.
Awesome, thanks. I think we are out of time, and thank you all so much. Thanks to our panelists, and thanks to everybody who's been here to watch, and looking forward to our continued conversations around our forests in Appalachia.
Yeah, I just want to remind everyone, thank you so much, panelists. You did a great job, and we've got another special panel this afternoon at 12:30 on the Mother Forest in the Mother Forest Strand, and then our final one is tomorrow morning at this same time, 9 a.m., and that will close out this strand. Thank you so much for being with us, everyone, and for your wonderful presentations, panelists and convener.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.